All right, what's up, guys? Jesse from Mad Naps here, and today we are going to be talking about the top 10 welterweights of all time. So, obviously, Kamaru Usman has won his most recent fight against Jorge Masvidal, and a lot of people have been talking about like where he stacks up compared to GSP, where he stacks up compared to the all-time greats. Some people are already calling him the greatest ever, which I think is kind of ridiculous. The dude only has 4 title defenses now. That is very impressive. I agree. But when you're comparing him to guys like St. Pierre, who had 9 title defenses, and that's not including his interim title win plus his initial title win. So if you count both those, he's actually 11. And then he also moved up, and although you actually can't count the middleweight stuff, but he did move up and also win the middleweight belt. But 11 title wins versus 5 is a big difference. That being said, I do think Usman is very, very good, and this is pretty much how I view the top 10 welterweights. So Sarah is obviously the one that I think most people might not like, just because a lot of people don't really like Sarah for some reason. I think he's got a better reputation now that he has his podcast and stuff, but 5-10 years ago there was like this deep hatred for the fact that he ever even held the title. And I don't really get that because he actually did have a pretty good career. Obviously, he was 9-4 going into the Ultimate Fighter, and then he ended up winning the Ultimate Fighter, in which he beat a lot of top guys, including Chris Lytle, and then obviously TKO'd GSP for the title. Now he would go on to immediately lose the title and then lose a unanimous decision to Hughes, and then he'd beat Frank Trigg, who was a perennial contender, and I don't think people give him enough credit for that win. That was a big win. He's also beat Ivan Menjivar, Jeff Curran, Eve Edwards, Kelly DeLauntry. He did lose to BJ Penn, though, in the lightweight tournament semifinal for the lightweight title. But the GSP win is probably the biggest one. The fact that he was able to get a win over GSP, he's one of the only 2 guys to get a win over GSP. GSP, yes, was able to come back and avenge that. But, winning that, being able to beat GSP, get that, just to hold on to that title for a little bit, and then to go on and beat a top contender afterwards. Even, he did lose to Hughes, but Hughes is an all-time great. And then he went on and beat Frank Trigg. He did prove himself as, a top 170-pounder of the day. Now, would he have been able to hold on to that belt consistently? I doubt. Like, had St. Pierre not been there, I doubt it. I think somebody else would have come along. There was a lot of top guys at the time that might have been able to, steal that from him pretty quickly. And, BJ Penn maybe being one of them. But what Sarah did, I think he doesn't get enough credit for. He was able to beat a lot of the top 170-pounders at the time in order to get that title shot in the first place. A lot of those guys on the Ultimate Fighter, the comeback, were some of the top guys at the time. That the UFC wasn't as deep back then, and a lot of veterans got cut on win streaks, and a lot of veterans got cut. I wouldn't even know if you would call it cut, but they couldn't afford them anymore, and they'd go to Japan, and then they'd come back. And the Ultimate Fighter, the comeback was a lot of those guys coming back. So anyway, I think he's highly underrated, and I do think he deserves the number 10 spot. Number 9, Carlos Condit. This one probably a lot less controversial. Carlos Condit's been a fan favorite forever. Pretty much the only thing people don't like about him is that he won the title against Nick Diaz, who a lot of people think Nick should have won that fight. You all often see the memes, Nick won 3-5. Other impressive wins, he has a knockout over Rory McDonald. He beat Thiago Alves, Martin Kampmann, Matt Brown, Court McGee, Jake Ellenberger, Dan Hardy, Dong Hyun Kim, fucking Carlo Prater, John Alessio. Yeah, he's beat most of the top guys, and especially on the tear he was going on from the, about 2006 to basically up until he lost to George St. Pierre. He was pretty much one of, if not the top guys. Maybe Jake Shields was above him for part of that. Martin Kampmann, who he ended up avenging his loss against. There were some guys that were arguably up there with him, but he was the one that ended up, when St. Pierre left, proving himself and winning that title, and kind of proving he was the second best guy in an era where St. Pierre held that title for nearly 10 years, over 10 years. So, I think Condit is the number 9 welterweight of all time. Next we got number 8, Johnny Hendricks. Obviously big rig. Post USADA hasn't had the best experience, and a lot of you might remove him from any top 10 all-time list because of that. But if you look at his record, when Big Rig was at his best, he was one of the top guys in the world. He was obviously able to go on that absolute tear where he blasted Fitch and Kampman across the mat. He beat Josh Koscheck. He beat Carlos Condit, who he had below on this list. And then he would lose the split decision to GSP in a fight that a lot of people actually thought he won. I didn't personally. I actually thought GSP won. And also he tapped. I thought that was pretty obvious when you watch the replay. You can clearly see Johnny Hendricks tapping. GSP lets go of the guillotine, but the ref didn't see it, and Johnny Hendricks and GSP both knew what was going to happen then. Johnny knew he was going to pretend, and GSP knew he was going to pretend, so they just started fighting right away. They didn't even bother going on with it. But yeah, anyway, he then went on to beat Robbie Lawler, who's, Robbie obviously went on a small tear of his own. He then lost to Robbie Lawler in an instant rematch, beat Matt Brown, beat Hector Lombard. He did lose to some guys later in his career, a lot of the next generation, I guess you'd call them, the guys that came after the wrestle boxers. He was kind of the last of that wrestle box era, I guess you could say. That 2000s fighting style, the late 2000s. He was one of the last guys from that fighting style. But yeah, I'd put Johnny Hendricks, especially when he was at his peak, when he was the UFC champion, as the number 8 of all time. This one, a little more recent. Maybe this one will be controversial too, because a lot of people don't like Covington, mostly because of his politics and because he can be kind of cringy sometimes, regardless of if you agree with his politics or not. But I think Colby Covington has one of the most impressive records of all time. Like Damian Maia, Dong Hyun Kim, Rafael dos Santos, former 155-pound champion, which he won the interim title against, beat Robbie Lawler, former 170-pound champion, and beat Tyron Woodley, former 170-pound champion. He has only lost to Kamaru Usman in one of the craziest fights, a fight that had Kamaru not knocked him out in the 5th round, with only 50 seconds left, he might have won that fight because that was just an insane fight. You had no idea who was winning any round. They were just throwing at each other. And Kamaru was definitely getting the harder hits in, which ended up getting him the knockout. But they were just smashing each other, and that could have gone either way when it went to the judges. And then earlier in his career, he lost to Warley Alves via a guillotine choke. That was his 4th UFC fight, but that was almost 5 years ago now. And he's a completely different fighter. But the current Colby Covington, assuming we see the same guy we saw against Kamaru and the same guy we saw against Woodley, I think he's the number 7 welterweight of all time. He's an amazing welterweight, and he might win the title. And even if he doesn't, I think the only reason that he's not champion is because Kamaru is so good. Next up, we got number 6. I got Robbie Lawler. So Robbie's actually had an insane UFC career overall. He at one point he was in a number 1 contender spot against Evan Tanner, which he unfortunately lost for the 185-pound title all the way back in 2004. After losing that fight, Robbie actually dropped out of the UFC, went on to go to Strikeforce, Elite XC, a bunch of other promotions, came back at UFC 157, went on a tear against Koscheck, Bobby Volker, Robbie Lawler in a really close split decision that people thought Rory won, Rory McDonald versus Robbie Lawler, the first one. Then he lost to Johnny Hendricks for the title. Then he went on another tear, which he beat Jake Ellenberger, Matt Brown, Johnny Hendricks, the Johnny Hendricks rematch obviously being for the title, which he won. Then he defended it 3 times. Rory McDonald in the craziest fight in welterweight history, just an absolute insane fight. And then Carlos Condit. Then he unfortunately lost to Tyron Woodley, beat Donald Cerrone, and then lost to Dos Anjos, Ben Askren, Colby Covington, and Neil Magny. So he hasn't had the best fights lately. He's supposed to be fighting against Mike Perry in a couple of UFCs, but when he was at his prime, that tear that he went on from pretty much his return from Strikeforce all the way until he lost the title to Woodley, he was just an absolute monster. And I think that he was just in too many wars, and it just kind of wore down on him eventually. He really hit his prime there, right? Like when he was early in his career, he was too young and not quite experienced enough, and he kind of felt that. And then he, once he got all the tools together, he came back to the UFC and he just dominated. And then obviously the wars caught up to him, especially that war with Rory. If you haven't seen that Rory McDonald versus Robbie Lawler 2, check it out. It is one of the all-time most insane fights. Okay, number 5, we got Tyron Woodley. So 19-7 record. Really has not been the same since he lost the title. And to be honest, you could kind of see this happening while he was champion. He started rapping, and it all just went downhill. That's pretty much all you can say about that. So obviously he was a holdover from Strikeforce when the UFC bought the Strikeforce. He had fought for the welterweight championship in Strikeforce, but was never able to win it. Nate Marquardt beat him. He then beat Jay Huron in his UFC debut, lost to Jake Shields in a split decision, Jake Shields is probably one of the best welterweights to never win the title, beat Josh Koscheck and former champion Carlos Condit. Then he lost a split decision to Rory McDonald, another guy who's up there as one of the best guys to never win the title. And after that, he went on a 6-fight win streak with 1 draw in the middle of that, with the first fight with Stephen Thompson, and that included winning the title against Robbie Lawler and then defending it against Thompson, Maia, and Till. So I think Woodley has one of the most impressive records in the history of the UFC, especially if you don't count his last 4 fights, because he's, the rap career ended him. The 3 title defenses, 4 if you include the draw against Thompson, just absolutely, insanely impressive. The guys he's beating Robbie Lawler, beating Carlos Condit, there's 2 former champions on his resume. Unfortunately, he wasn't able to, hold back Usman or Covington, pick up another one of those. But it is what it is, and I think, had Woodley not rapped, he'd probably be higher on this list. But unfortunately, he decided he was going to start rapping and stop fighting, and so he only made it number 5. Number 4 is Pat Miletich. So Pat Miletich was the original UFC welterweight champion and had one of the weirdest UFC careers because it was back in the old days. He won the belt, defended it, went and fought in 2 other promotions, came back, fought in the UFC, went and fought in 2 other promotions, came back, fought in the UFC, went and fought in another promotion, came back, fought in the UFC, and all this time he held the title the entire time. So he is kind of in a weird position compared to a lot of the other guys. But his UFC career specifically, he was able to grab that title, hold on to it for 4 defenses before he ended up losing it. He did have some fights outside of the UFC in which he did lose, although some of those were above 170 pounds. So at the time, just a pioneer in the sport, one of the original greats of the sport, would go on to found Miletich Training Systems, which would produce pretty much half to 3/4 of the champions of the early to mid 2000s. Just an absolute animal, and partly because of being the original, and partly because of having those 4 title defenses. Even though he didn't face the best competition because of the era, it wasn't as deep as it is now, and the division being so new, I still think he deserves a number 4 spot. So Kamaru Usman is who I have at number 3, 19-1. Obviously, just been on an absolute tear lately. Rafael dos Anjos, Tyron Woodley, Colby Covington, back to back to back. That is very, very impressive. You've got the former lightweight champion, the former welterweight champion, and the former interim welterweight champion all back-to-back-to-back, decision, TKO. On top of that, he's just won decision against Jorge Masvidal, a TKO against Gilbert Burns, and a KO against Jorge Masvidal most recently, to tie Pat Miletich with the 4 title defenses, which puts him at the tied for third most in the UFC welterweight history. I put his 4 above Miletich's 4 for a number of reasons. One, obviously, that the level of the competition nowadays is so much higher than it was back in the late 1990s, early 2000s. Number 2, Miletich went outside of the UFC and fought other guys. Although some of those fights were at other weight classes, he did lose some of those fights. Usman has not lost as the champion even outside of his weight class. He hasn't fought outside of his weight class, but he hasn't lost outside of his weight class. But yeah, the competition, the fact that he wasn't messing around doing other things, the way in which he wins, Miletich won very close split decisions a lot of the time, whereas Usman is knocked 3 of his last 4 opponents out. And yeah, just all around, Usman is on an absolute tear right now. He might go down as, the number 2 or even the number 1 of all time, although I wouldn't put him there yet with just the 4 defenses, and especially with just the 4 defenses against who they are, because even though the talent pool is deeper right now, obviously the second Jorge Masvidal fight was kind of a gimme title defense. Right? It was a free title defense for him. Everyone knew he was going to beat the shit out of him. Jorge never should have got that title shot. So, yeah. If he's still facing the top competition, which I think that they'll force him to after the Jorge fight, I don't think they'll give him another gimme fight, at least not for a couple fights. He might be able to go on a tear like a Hughes or a GSP, but as of right now, I still put him a couple steps behind those guys. But even though, and with him tying Miletich's record, even though Miletich was the original, because of the competition he's faced, I think his is much more impressive. Number 2 is Matt Hughes. So Matt Hughes, a lot of people view as kind of the original welterweight GOAT, although I guess, you kind of argue that was Pat Miletich by default for being the first welterweight champion. But it's kind of the nickname that he's got these days, is the original welterweight GOAT. He won the belt, defended it 5 times, I think. He defended it 5 times, then lost it, then regained it, and defended it twice. So, one of the most impressive records in UFC history, regardless of the weight class, but especially in welterweight. Well, I guess really not, especially in welterweight, considering GSP is one of the most impressive records. But yeah, just an absolutely insanely impressive record. Yeah, just went on an absolute tear before the UFC. By the time he got to the UFC, he was 29-3. Then in the UFC, he ended up fighting for the title literally in his first fight against Carlos Newton. Knocked out Carlos Newton with a slam. An amazing fight. If you ever have a chance, you should watch it. He then went on a 5-fight defense streak before losing to BJ Penn, who is another all-time great, in my opinion, one of the best lightweights ever, although his welterweight career wasn't as impressive. He did win the title, so it was very good, but he didn't have the long dominating streak like he did at lightweight. He also beat Sean Shirkin that time, who's another former lightweight champion. And then after losing to BJ, he won against Renato Verasumo in order to get the match with GSP for the interim title, which he won. The only 2 men to ever beat St. Pierre. He then beat Frank Trigg, Joe Riggs, Royce Gracie, and BJ Penn in a couple of title defenses and catchweight fights. The Riggs fight was actually supposed to be a title defense, but Riggs failed to make weight. And the Royce Gracie fight was just a catchweight legends fight. He then got knocked out by St. Pierre, won against Lytle, submission by St. Pierre, got knocked out by Thiago, beat Matt Serra, beat Renzo Gracie, beat Ricardo Almeida, lost to BJ Penn, and lost to Josh Koscheck. So by the very end of his career, he was starting to lose to guys who weren't quite at his level, like the Thiago Alves's and the Josh Koschecks. And then he ended up retiring. But when Matt was at his peak, he was just an absolute animal. I mean, Carlos Newton, Sean Shirk, George St. Pierre, Royce Gracie, BJ Penn, Matt Serra. That's just champion after champion after champion after champion that he beat. He held the title longer than anyone until St. Pierre. At one point, he was probably the greatest pound-for-pound fighter of all time, let alone the greatest welterweight, even though St. Pierre would go on to take both those from him. But yeah, just Matt Hughes has an absolutely just amazing, impressive career. Number 1, yeah, I think that's pretty obvious. There's not really anyone that competes with St. Pierre at welterweight when it comes to all-time greatness. The closest person to him in title defenses is Matt Hughes, who he had a trilogy with. He went 2-1. Matt Hughes beat him when he was young, when he first tried to challenge for the welterweight championship, and he was unable to get it. He would then come back and take the championship from Matt Hughes and then defend it against Matt Hughes. He would take it from Matt Hughes and then win the interim championship after losing the championship to Serra. He'd win the interim championship against Hughes because Serra was injured, and then he would regain his title against Serra. But just the people he beat is just absolutely insane. Like Matt Hughes twice, Sean Shirk, Matt Serra, BJ Penn twice, Carlos Condit, Johnny Hendricks, Thiago Alves, John Fitch, Josh Koscheck. I think I already said Josh Koscheck, but he actually beat him twice, so we can count twice. Caro Parisian, Pete Spratt, Ivan Menjivar, Frank Trigg, Jason Miller, Jake Shields. I think I already said him. But just so many people. Like, he's beat probably more champions than anyone except maybe John Jones. And he's beat champions that from 155 pounds all the way to 185 pounds. BJ Penn is arguably the greatest lightweight of all time. Beat him twice. Matt Hughes, arguably the greatest welterweight of all time. Beat him twice. Michael Bisping, probably not the greatest middleweight of all time, but a great middleweight. I'd say top 5 middleweight of all time. Beat him. I think St. Pierre is one of the greatest pound-for-pound fighters of all time and clearly the greatest welterweight. So that is where I rank all-time top 10 welterweights. Let me know what you think below. How much do you hate me for putting Serra on the list? I know a lot of people are going to say BJ Penn deserves to be there, or Nick Diaz. Who else? Maybe we'll get a Carlos Newton fan. I don't know. But the reason I didn't put some of those guys on is because I feel like in a UFC all-time great list, if there's been at least 10 champions, then you've got to have been at least a champion, right? If you're never able to hold the title, then how can you claim to be one of those top 10 greats if 10 guys have held it? Obviously, in the women's division, it's a little bit easier. If there's a division like 145, there's only ever been 3 champions, so the top 10. I don't even know if there's 10 girls in the UFC right now in that division. So if the top 10 ever are the top 10 right now. But with welterweight division that's much, much more storied, been going on for 20 some odd years now, 25 years nearly. There's a lot more built-in history, and you have to at least win that title in order to be an option for the top 10 list. So this is how I view it. Let me know what you think.